The history of American slavery contains many dark chapters that have been systematically hidden from mainstream narratives. Today we examine one of the most uncomfortable and least discussed aspects of this brutal institution: the sexual exploitation and abuse of enslaved black men by white women in positions of power. When we think about sexual violence during slavery, our minds typically turn to the well-documented abuse of enslaved women by white masters. However, historical records reveal a more complex and disturbing picture that includes the systematic abuse of enslaved men by white women, particularly plantation mistresses and daughters of slave owners. This abuse took many forms and was enabled by the same power structures that allowed all forms of exploitation under slavery. White women, despite their own limitations in patriarchal society, still held absolute power over enslaved people. They could demand sexual services, punish resistance, and face no legal consequences for their actions. The legal system of the antebellum South made it virtually impossible for enslaved men to report or resist such abuse. Any accusation against a white woman could result in immediate execution, often without trial. The mere suggestion of impropriety between a black man and white woman was enough to trigger violent mob justice. Historical documents from plantation records, court cases, and personal diaries reveal numerous instances of this abuse. Some plantation mistresses would specifically request certain enslaved men for personal service in their quarter. Others would use the threat of false accusations to coerce compliance with their demands. The psychological impact on enslaved men was devastating. They were trapped between the impossible choice of compliance or death. Resistance meant not only their own destruction, but potentially violent retaliation against their families and communities. Some white women used their relationships with enslaved men as a form of rebellion against their own restrictive society. But this did not make the relationships consensual. The power imbalance made true consent impossible, and enslaved men had no real choice in the matter. The children born from these relationships faced particular cruelty. Unlike the mixed-race children of white masters, who sometimes received minimal protection or advantages, the children of white women and enslaved men were often sold away immediately or faced extreme abuse. Many white women would fabricate stories of rape or assault when pregnancies resulted from these relationships. This not only protected their reputations, but often led to the execution or severe punishment of the men they had previously coerced. The complicity of white society in maintaining this system of abuse cannot be overstated. Everyone understood what was happening, but the maintenance of white supremacist power structures took precedence over justice or human decency. Some enslaved men tried to protect themselves by working in fields far from the main house. But domestic servants and skilled craftsmen often had no escape from proximity to their abusers. The most vulnerable were often young men who had been specifically chosen for their appearance or perceived compliance. The trauma of this abuse extended beyond the immediate victim. Entire enslaved communities lived in fear, knowing that any one of their men could be targeted and that resistance would bring collective punishment. Religious justifications were often used to rationalize this abuse, with white women claiming biblical authority over their property and framing their demands as natural rights of ownership. The economic system of slavery created additional pressures that enabled this abuse. Enslaved men who were skilled craftsmen or who brought profit to the plantation were sometimes specifically targeted, as their compliance could be ensured through threats to their livelihood or family members. After emancipation, many formerly enslaved men carried the trauma of these experiences with them. The psychological scars of sexual abuse, combined with the broader trauma of slavery, affected entire generations of families. The historical silence around this topic has multiple causes. The shame felt by survivors, the danger of speaking about such experiences in the Jim Crow era, and the general reluctance of society to acknowledge the full extent of slavery's horrors, all contributed to this silence. Academic historians have only recently begun to seriously examine this aspect of slavery. For decades, the focus remained primarily on the abuse of enslaved women, while the experiences of enslaved men received less attention and analysis. The intersection of racism and sexism created unique vulnerabilities for enslaved black men. While white women faced restrictions in patriarchal society, they still wielded absolute power over enslaved people, and this power was often exercised in brutal ways. The legal concept of social death applied to enslaved people meant that they had no legal personhood and therefore no protection from any form of abuse. This legal framework enabled and protected white women who chose to exploit their power. Some plantation records show that certain white women developed reputations for particular cruelty toward enslaved men. These women often faced no consequences from their communities, as the abuse of enslaved people was seen as a private matter of property management. The role of other white women enabling this abuse cannot be ignored. Many knew what was happening, but chose silence to protect the system that also granted them certain privileges, even as it restricted them in other ways. The impact on family structures within enslaved communities was severe. Men who were being abused often couldn't protect their own families from similar abuse, creating additional psychological trauma and feelings of powerlessness. Some enslaved men attempted suicide rather than continue enduring sexual abuse. Historical records document several such cases, though the true extent will never be known due to the lack of comprehensive record-keeping regarding enslaved people's experiences. The geographic variations in this type of abuse reflected broader patterns of slavery. Areas with large plantations and fewer white men often saw higher rates of abuse by white women, as did regions where enslaved people outnumbered whites significantly. The clothing and personal effects of enslaved men were sometimes controlled by abusive white women, as another form of psychological dominance. This control extended to their living conditions, work assignments, and even their relationships with other enslaved people. When enslaved men tried to form relationships with enslaved women, abusive white mistresses sometimes intervened violently, seeing these relationships as competition for their control and access. The children of enslaved communities often witnessed these abuses, creating intergenerational trauma that affected their understanding of power, sexuality, and safety. This trauma became part of the collective memory of enslaved communities. Some white women used the threat of separation from family as leverage to ensure compliance with sexual demands. The slave trade's destruction of families became another weapon in the arsenal of abuse. The medical treatment of enslaved people was sometimes controlled by white women, who used access to health care as another form of coercive control. Injuries from abuse often went untreated as punishment for resistance. The religious life of enslaved communities was affected by these abuses. Some enslaved men lost faith entirely, while others found strength in religious communities that provided the only space for processing trauma and finding support. The seasonal patterns of plantation work sometimes created opportunities for increased abuse. During periods when white men were away for extended times, some white women exercised even greater control and made more frequent demands on enslaved men. The hiring out of enslaved men to other plantations sometimes provided temporary relief from abusive situations, but it also exposed them to new forms of exploitation and made family connections even more difficult to maintain. The role of alcohol in facilitating abuse cannot be ignored. Some white women used alcohol consumption as an excuse for their behavior, while others deliberately intoxicated enslaved men to make them more vulnerable to abuse. The education and literacy restrictions placed on enslaved people served multiple purposes, including preventing them from documenting their experiences or communicating with the outside world about abuse they were suffering. Some enslaved men developed mental health conditions as a result of prolonged sexual abuse. The lack of any mental health support or understanding made recovery impossible, and often led to behavior that was then punished as defiance or mad. The Underground Railroad and other escape networks sometimes specifically helped enslaved men who were fleeing sexual abuse. However, the particular shame associated with this type of abuse made many men reluctant to reveal their true reasons for escape. The transition to sharecropping and tenant farming after emancipation sometimes perpetuated similar power dynamics. As white landowners' wives continued to wield significant power over black agricultural workers and their families, the development of racial terror and lynching in the post-emancipation period was partly designed to prevent formerly enslaved men from ever speaking about their experiences of abuse during slavery. The threat of violence ensured continued silence. The impact on black masculinity was profound and lasting. Men who had been systematically abused and emasculated during slavery faced additional challenges in rebuilding their sense of self and their roles within their families and communities after emancipation. Some formerly enslaved men who had experienced sexual abuse became advocates for other survivors, though they often had to speak in coded language to avoid retaliation. Their advocacy helped other survivors understand that they were not alone in their experience. The medical consequences of sexual abuse were often severe and untreated. Sexually transmitted diseases, physical injuries, and other health problems resulting from abuse received no medical attention and often led to long-term suffering. The economic exploitation of enslaved people was intertwined with sexual abuse in complex ways. Some white women profited directly from the skills and labor of the men they abused, creating additional layers of exploitation beyond the sexual violence. The social isolation experienced by survivors of abuse was compounded by the broader social isolation of slavery. Men who were being abused often had no one they could safely confide in, as any disclosure could endanger themselves and others. The intergenerational effects of this trauma extended well beyond the immediate survivors. The children and grandchildren of abuse survivors often carried the psychological and social impacts of their ancestors' experiences, even when the specific details were never shared. The role of white churches in enabling and justifying this abuse reveals the deep corruption of religious institutions under slavery. Many white congregations taught that enslaved people existed solely for the use of their owners, providing religious cover for all forms of exploitation. The limited historical documentation of this abuse means that many stories will never be known. The perspectives and experiences of countless enslaved men have been lost forever, making it impossible to fully understand the scope and impact of this systematic violence. The recovery and healing process for survivors was complicated by the ongoing threat of violence and retaliation. Even after emancipation, speaking about these experiences could result in death or severe punishment, preventing many survivors from ever finding peace or justice. The strength and resilience demonstrated by survivors of this abuse represents one of the most remarkable aspects of this tragic history. Despite facing unimaginable trauma and having no legal protection or recourse, many men found ways to survive, resist, and maintain their humanity under the most dehumanizing conditions. Understanding this hidden history is crucial for comprehending the full scope of slavery's horrors and the lasting impact of these experiences on American society. The systematic sexual abuse of enslaved black men by white women was not aberrant behavior, but rather an integral part of the broader system of racial and sexual exploitation that defined American slavery. The silence that has surrounded this topic for generations must be broken if we are to truly understand our history and work toward justice and healing. The experiences of these men deserve recognition, and their suffering should never be forgotten or dismissed. The courage required to examine this difficult history is significant, but it is necessary for honest historical accounting. Only by facing the full truth of slavery's horrors can we begin to understand the deep roots of racial trauma and inequality that continue to affect American society today. The voices of enslaved men who experienced sexual abuse have been silenced for too long. While we cannot bring justice to these historical victims, we can honor their memory by ensuring their experiences are acknowledged and remembered as part of the complete historical record. This examination of hidden historical trauma reveals the complex intersections of race, gender, and power that shape the American experience. The abuse of enslaved black men by white women demonstrates how systems of oppression create victims and perpetrators in unexpected configurations while maintaining overall structures of domination. The lasting impact of this history extends into contemporary discussions of sexual violence, racial justice, and historical memory. Understanding these experiences helps illuminate how trauma becomes embedded in communities and how silence can perpetuate harm across generations. Breaking the silence around this topic requires courage from historians, educators, and community members willing to confront uncomfortable truths about our past. Only through honest examination of all aspects of slavery's brutality can we work toward genuine reconciliation and justice. The story of these enslaved men and their experiences of abuse must be told with sensitivity, respect, and commitment to historical accuracy. Their suffering was real. Their resilience was remarkable, and their stories deserve to be part of our collective memory and understanding of American history. This hidden chapter of American slavery reminds us that the full truth of historical trauma is often more complex and painful than simplified narratives suggest. Confronting this complexity is essential for understanding how past injustices continue to shape present realities and for working toward a more just and equitable future. The psychological warfare employed against enslaved men went far beyond physical abuse. White women often used manipulation tactics designed to break down their victims' sense of self-worth and resistance. These techniques included alternating between false kindness and sudden cruelty, creating confusion and dependency that made resistance even more difficult. The seasonal cycles of plantation life created predictable patterns of abuse that enslaved men learned to dread. Harvest times, when male overseers might be occupied elsewhere, often coincided with increased demands from white women, who took advantage of reduced supervision and increased privacy. Some white women formed alliances with other family members to facilitate their abuse of enslaved men. Mothers and daughters sometimes shared victims, or sisters would cover for each other's activities, creating networks of abuse that made escape or resistance nearly impossible. The tools of everyday plantation life became instruments of coercion and punishment. Kitchen implements, sewing equipment, and household items were weaponized to threaten and harm enslaved men who resisted sexual demands or who attempted to report abuse to other white family members. The isolation of rural plantations provided perfect cover for systematic abuse. Miles from any outside authority or witness, white women could act with complete impunity, knowing that their victims had no recourse and no hope of rescue or intervention. The education system that emerged after slavery deliberately obscured these histories. Textbooks and curricula focused on sanitized versions of plantation life that portrayed white women as delicate and pure, making it impossible for future generations to understand the full scope of abuse that occurred. Economic records from plantations sometimes contain coded references to this abuse. Entries about personal services, special duties, or household assignments often masked the reality of sexual exploitation, creating a paper trail that historians are only now learning to interpret correctly. The role of clothing and personal appearance in this abuse was significant. White women often controlled how enslaved men dressed, groomed themselves, and presented their bodies, using these controls as both preparation for abuse and as ongoing psychological domination. The development of racial stereotypes about black male sexuality was partly designed to deflect attention from the reality of white women as sexual aggressors. By portraying black men as inherently dangerous and predatory, white society created a narrative that made it impossible to discuss white women as perpetrators of sexual violence. The impact on enslaved women who witnessed the abuse of their male family members created additional layers of trauma within enslaved communities. Wives, mothers, and sisters often had to watch helplessly as their loved ones were systematically abused, knowing that any intervention would result in punishment for the entire family. Some enslaved men developed elaborate strategies for avoiding situations where they might be vulnerable to abuse. These included requesting fieldwork assignments, avoiding certain areas of the plantation house, and developing relationships with male overseers who might provide some protection. The medical knowledge of the time was sometimes used to facilitate abuse. White women who understood anatomy and physiology used this knowledge to inflict pain and control without leaving obvious evidence that might expose their activities to other white family members. The spiritual and religious coping mechanisms developed by enslaved men often focused on concepts of ultimate justice and divine retribution. Many found strength in religious beliefs that promised eventual accountability for their abusers, even if earthly justice was impossible. The hiring and leasing systems that allowed enslaved people to work temporarily for other families sometimes provided brief respites from abuse. However, these same systems also exposed men to new potential abusers and created additional uncertainties about their safety and security. The role of alcohol and other substances in facilitating abuse cannot be underestimated. Some white women deliberately intoxicated their victims to reduce resistance, while others used their own substance use as justification for behavior they knew was wrong but continued anyway. The development of safe communication networks within enslaved communities became crucial for survival. Men who were being abused developed coded ways of warning others about dangerous situations and sharing strategies for protection and resistance. The intersection of age and vulnerability created particular dangers for both very young and older enslaved men. Adolescents were often targeted because they were seen as less likely to resist or report abuse, while older men faced abuse as a form of humiliation designed to break down their authority within enslaved communities. The seasonal migration patterns of some wealthy families created additional opportunities for abuse. When families traveled between different properties or spent extended periods at vacation homes, the isolation and disruption of normal routines provided cover for increased exploitation. The role of other enslaved people as unwilling witnesses to abuse created complex dynamics within enslaved communities. Those who saw abuse occurring faced impossible choices between their own safety and their desire to help victims, leading to feelings of guilt and complicity that added to community trauma. The legal concept of criminal conversation, which allowed white husbands to sue for damages when their wives had affairs, specifically excluded relationships with enslaved people. This legal exclusion sent a clear message that enslaved men were not considered fully human, and that abuse against them was not legally recognized. The development of resistance strategies among enslaved men required incredible creativity and courage. Some men learned to document their experiences through oral traditions, songs, and coded stories that preserved their testimonies for future generations, while avoiding immediate punishment. The impact of this abuse on concepts of masculinity and fatherhood within enslaved communities was profound. Men who were being systematically emasculated through sexual abuse faced additional challenges in fulfilling traditional male roles as protectors and providers for their families. The use of pregnancy as a weapon of control revealed the calculating nature of much of this abuse. White women who became pregnant from relationships with enslaved men often used the threat of claiming rape to ensure continued compliance and silence from their victims. The role of domestic spaces in facilitating abuse made it impossible for enslaved men to feel safe anywhere on the plantation. Bedrooms, parlors, kitchens, and other areas of the house became sites of potential violence, creating constant anxiety and hypervigilance. The intergenerational transmission of trauma within enslaved communities meant that children grew up understanding these dangers, even when specific incidents were not discussed. This knowledge shaped their behavior, relationships, and understanding of power dynamics from an early age. The economic calculations that some white women made regarding their abuse of enslaved men revealed the intersection of sexual violence and financial exploitation. Some women specifically chose victims based on their skills, earning potential, or value as property, adding economic considerations to their sexual predation. The role of poison and other methods of slow violence in this abuse has been largely overlooked by historians. Some white women used their knowledge of herbs and medicines to slowly harm their victims in ways that would not be immediately obvious to others. The development of mental health conditions among survivors often manifested in ways that were misunderstood by their community. Depression, anxiety, and other trauma responses were sometimes interpreted as spiritual problems or character flaws, rather than understandable reactions to systematic abuse. The impact on family formation within enslaved communities was severe. Men who had experienced sexual abuse often struggled with intimacy and trust, making it difficult to form healthy relationships even within the limited opportunities available under slavery. The role of gossip and social control within white communities sometimes provided limited protection for enslaved men. White women, who developed reputations for inappropriate behavior with enslaved people, occasionally faced social pressure that reduced their access to victims. The use of medical examinations and inspections as cover for abuse was another tactic employed by some white women. Under the guise of checking for illness or injury, they gained access to enslaved men's bodies for their own gratification while maintaining the appearance of legitimate medical care. The development of code words and signals within enslaved communities allowed for some communication about dangerous situations without alerting potential abusers. These communication systems represented sophisticated forms of resistance and mutual protection. The impact of this abuse on enslaved men's relationships with their own children was complex and painful. Fathers who were being systematically abused faced challenges in teaching their sons about masculinity and self-protection while avoiding topics that might put the entire family at risk. The seasonal patterns of abuse often coincided with periods of increased plantation productivity. White women sometimes timed their exploitation to periods when enslaved men were most valuable to the plantation's operations, using economic leverage to ensure compliance. The role of clothing and personal items as rewards or punishments in abusive relationships created additional psychological control mechanisms. White women would provide or withhold basic necessities based on compliance with their demands, creating dependency relationships that extended beyond sexual abuse. The impact on community leadership structures within enslaved populations was significant. Men who might have served as informal leaders or sources of guidance were often specifically targeted for abuse as a way of undermining community cohesion and resistance. The use of religious imagery and biblical justifications for abuse revealed the deep corruption of Christian institutions under slavery. White women often quoted scripture to justify their treatment of enslaved men, perverting religious teachings to support their exploitation. The development of elaborate fantasy narratives by some white women about their relationships with enslaved men served to rationalize behavior they knew was abusive. These fantasies often portrayed the abuse as romantic relationships or mutual attractions, denying the reality of coercion and exploitation. The impact on artistic and cultural expression within enslaved communities included the development of songs, stories, and other forms of art that encoded references to sexual abuse and survival. These cultural products preserved experiences that could not be spoken about directly. The role of other white women as enablers and protectors of abuse varied significantly. While some women facilitate each other's exploitation of enslaved men, others occasionally intervene to protect victims, though such interventions were rare and limited in effectiveness. The geographic isolation of many plantations meant that some enslaved men experienced years of systematic abuse with no outside contact or hope of intervention. The psychological impact of such complete isolation and helplessness was devastating and often led to long-term mental health consequences. The intersection of sexual abuse with other forms of violence created particularly traumatic experiences for enslaved men. Physical beatings, torture, and other violence were often combined with sexual abuse in ways designed to maximize psychological damage and ensure compliance. The role of pregnancy and childbearing in abuse dynamics created additional complications. When white women became pregnant from relationships with enslaved men, the resulting children faced particular dangers, and the men were often punished severely or sold away to eliminate evidence of the relationship. The development of survival strategies among enslaved men included learning to read the moods and behaviors of their abusers. This hypervigilance became a survival skill that many men carried with them long after emancipation, affecting their ability to form trusting relationships. The impact on food systems and nutrition within enslaved communities was another overlooked aspect of this abuse. White women sometimes controlled food distribution as another mechanism of coercion, using hunger and malnutrition to make enslaved men more compliant with sexual demands. The role of literacy and education restrictions in perpetuating abuse was significant. Enslaved men who might have been able to document their experiences or communicate with outside authorities were deliberately kept illiterate, ensuring their silence and preventing them from seeking help. The seasonal cycles of pregnancy and childbirth among white women sometimes created periods of increased danger for enslaved men. During times when white women were recovering from childbirth or experiencing other health issues, they sometimes became more unpredictable and violent in their abuse. The impact on religious and spiritual practices within enslaved communities included the development of healing rituals and ceremonies designed to help survivors of sexual abuse. These practices often combined African spiritual traditions with Christian elements, creating unique forms of trauma treatment and community support. The role of economic dependency in maintaining abusive relationships was crucial. Enslaved men who had special skills or who were allowed small privileges were often specifically targeted because their economic value to their abusers made them less likely to be sold away or severely punished. The development of resistance networks that included both enslaved and free black people sometimes provided limited assistance to men experiencing sexual abuse. However, the extreme dangers involved in helping such victims meant that assistance was rare and often inadequate to address the scope of the problem. The impact on concepts of justice and fairness within enslaved communities was profound. Witnessing the complete impunity with which white women could abuse black men reinforced the understanding that the legal and social systems were designed to protect whiteness at any cost. The long-term health consequences of sexual abuse often went untreated throughout the survivor's lifetime. Physical injuries, sexually transmitted diseases, and psychological trauma received no medical attention and often led to premature death or lifelong disability. The role of transportation and communication systems in perpetuating abuse cannot be overlooked. The isolation created by poor roads and limited communication meant that enslaved men had no way to reach potential sources of help or intervention, ensuring their continued vulnerability to abuse. The development of coded language within enslaved communities became essential for discussing abuse without alerting white listeners. Words and phrases that seemed innocent to outsiders carried specific meanings about danger, safety, and survival strategies, creating a secret vocabulary of resistance and protection. The impact of this abuse on sleep patterns and rest cycles was severe. Many enslaved men developed chronic insomnia and other sleep disorders as a result of constant vigilance and trauma, affecting their physical health and ability to perform the demanding labor required of them. The role of seasonal weather patterns in creating opportunities for abuse was significant. Winter months, when outdoor work was limited and enslaved people spent more time indoors, often saw increased rates of sexual exploitation as white women had more access to their victims in confined spaces. The intersection of sexual abuse with punishment systems on plantations created particularly cruel dynamics. Some white women would falsely accuse enslaved men of minor infractions as pretexts for private discipline sessions that were actually opportunities for sexual abuse. The impact on father-son relationships within enslaved families was devastating. Fathers who were experiencing sexual abuse often struggled to maintain authority and provide guidance to their sons, while simultaneously trying to prepare them for similar dangers without traumatizing them unnecessarily. The role of domestic architecture in facilitating abuse reveals how plantation houses were designed with power dynamics in mind. Hidden passages, private chambers, and isolated wings provided perfect settings for abuse while ensuring that victims' cries for help would not be heard by potential witnesses. The development of physical symptoms among abuse survivors often included stress-related illnesses that went unrecognized and untreated. Digestive problems, headaches, and other chronic conditions were frequently the result of prolonged trauma, but were attributed to other causes or simply ignored. The use of animals and pets as weapons of psychological control was another tactic employed, by some abusive white women, threats against beloved animals, or forcing enslaved men to witness animal cruelty, became additional tools for ensuring compliance with sexual demand. The impact of this abuse on musical and cultural traditions within enslaved communities was complex. Some songs and spirituals encoded references to sexual violence and survival, while others provided emotional outlets for processing trauma that could not be discussed openly. The role of pregnancy scares and false pregnancy claims in maintaining control over enslaved men created ongoing psychological torture. White women would sometimes claim to be pregnant as a way of ensuring continued compliance, regardless of whether pregnancies were real or fabricated. The seasonal hiring out of enslaved men to other plantations sometimes provided temporary relief from abusive situations, but it also exposed them to new dangers and made it impossible to develop consistent survival strategies or support networks. The impact on religious leadership within enslaved communities was significant. Men who served as preachers or spiritual leaders often became specific targets for sexual abuse as a way of undermining their authority and breaking down community cohesion and morale. The role of medical knowledge in both facilitating and treating the consequences of abuse was complex. While some white women used medical knowledge to harm their victims, others in the enslaved community developed healing practices specifically designed to help survivors cope with trauma. The development of elaborate gift-giving rituals by some abusive white women served to confuse their victims and create false narratives about the nature of their relationships. These gifts were often presented as tokens of affection, but were actually tools of manipulation and control. The impact on work productivity and plantation economics was sometimes significant. Enslaved men who were experiencing ongoing sexual abuse often showed decreased work performance, leading to additional punishment and creating cycles of violence that extended beyond the sexual abuse itself. The role of other enslaved women in supporting male survivors of abuse was crucial, but dangerous. Women who tried to provide emotional support or practical assistance to abused men risked being targeted for abuse themselves or facing punishment for interfering with their owner's property. The intersection of sexual abuse with breeding programs on plantations created particularly horrific situations. Enslaved men who were selected for breeding purposes often faced sexual abuse from white women who wanted to control every aspect of their reproductive lives. The development of self-harm behaviors among some survivors represented desperate attempts to make themselves less attractive to their abusers or to regain some sense of control over their own bodies. These behaviors often led to additional punishment and medical neglect. The role of alcohol and drug substances in both facilitating abuse and helping survivors cope with trauma was complex. While substances were sometimes used to make victims more compliant, they also became coping mechanisms that could lead to addiction and additional health problems. The impact on storytelling traditions within enslaved communities included the development of cautionary tales that warned young men about potential dangers, while avoiding explicit descriptions that might traumatize listeners or alert white audiences to their true meaning. The seasonal patterns of white family social events often coincided with increased abuse. Holiday celebrations, family visits, and other social gatherings sometimes provided cover for abuse or created situations where white women felt emboldened to act on their predatory impulses. The role of personal hygiene and grooming requirements in abuse dynamics cannot be overlooked. White women often controlled these aspects of their victims' lives as both preparation for abuse and as ongoing assertions of ownership and control over their body. The impact on community decision-making processes within enslaved populations was severe. Men who were experiencing sexual abuse often withdrew from leadership roles and community discussions, depriving communities of their wisdom and guidance at crucial moments. The development of elaborate justification narratives by white women often involved claims about civilizing or educating their victims. These narratives served to rationalize behavior that they knew was exploitative while maintaining their self-image as benevolent and moral individuals. The role of seasonal agricultural cycles in creating vulnerability patterns meant that certain times of year became associated with increased danger. Planting seasons, harvest times, and periods of intense agricultural work all created different opportunities and risks for potential abuse. The impact on courtship and marriage patterns within enslaved communities was profound. Men who had experienced sexual abuse often struggled with intimacy and trust, making it difficult to form healthy romantic relationships even within the limited opportunities available under slavery. The intersection of sexual abuse with punishment and reward systems created complex psychological conditioning. Enslaved men learned to associate compliance with survival and resistance with severe consequence, creating behavioral patterns that persisted long after emancipation. The role of written communication in documenting and perpetuating abuse was limited but significant. Some white women kept diaries or wrote letters that contained coded references to their exploitation of enslaved men, creating historical evidence that modern researchers are learning to interpret. The development of protective rituals and spiritual practices among survivors often combined elements from multiple religious traditions. These practices provided psychological comfort and community support while helping survivors maintain their sense of humanity and dignity despite ongoing dehumanization. The impact on concepts of masculinity and gender roles within enslaved communities was complex and long-lasting. Traditional ideas about male strength and protection were challenged by the reality of systematic sexual exploitation, requiring communities to develop new understandings of strength and survival. The role of economic leverage in maintaining abusive relationships extended beyond the plantation system. White women sometimes used their control over financial resources, property, and business relationships to ensure continued access to their victims even after formal emancipation. The seasonal patterns of white women's social activities often created predictable windows of danger for enslaved men. Times when white women were bored, isolated, or seeking entertainment often coincided with increased rates of sexual exploitation and abuse. The impact on educational and literacy efforts within enslaved communities included the understanding that knowledge could be both protective and dangerous. While literacy might provide some protection through communication with outside authorities, it also made enslaved people more valuable and therefore more likely to be targeted for special attention. The development of collective memory practices within enslaved communities served to preserve the experiences of abuse survivors while protecting the details from white audiences. These practices ensured that future generations would understand the dangers they faced without providing evidence that could be used against them. The role of seasonal migration patterns among wealthy white families created additional opportunities for abuse, while also providing some men with temporary respites. The disruption of normal routines during travel often created both new dangers and new opportunities for resistance or escape. The impact on healing and medical practices within enslaved communities included the development of treatments specifically designed to address the physical and psychological consequences of sexual abuse. These practices often combined African traditional medicine with knowledge gained through painful experience. The intersection of sexual abuse with other forms of racial violence created compound trauma that was particularly difficult to process and heal from. The combination of sexual violence with physical brutality, psychological torture, and social humiliation created wounds that affected multiple generations. The role of climate and weather patterns in creating vulnerability extended beyond seasonal cycles to include extreme weather events. Storms, floods, and other natural disasters often created situations of increased isolation and vulnerability that some white women exploited for their own purposes. The development of resistance strategies that involved apparent compliance was one of the most sophisticated survival techniques developed by enslaved men. Learning to appear cooperative while actually maintaining psychological distance and planning for eventual escape or revenge required incredible mental strength and strategic thinking. The impact on community healing and recovery processes meant that entire enslaved populations had to develop ways of supporting trauma survivors while managing their own fear and vulnerability. These community responses represented remarkable examples of collective resilience and mutual aid under the most difficult circumstances. The role of documentation and record-keeping in both hiding and revealing abuse was complex. While official plantation records rarely mentioned sexual abuse directly, careful analysis of personnel assignments, living arrangements, and disciplinary actions sometimes reveals patterns that suggest systematic exploitation. The seasonal cycles of crop production created different types of vulnerability throughout the year. During busy agricultural seasons, the exhaustion and stress of intensive labor made enslaved men more vulnerable to abuse, while slower periods might provide more opportunities for resistance or escape attempts. The impact on intergenerational relationships within enslaved families was severe and long-lasting. Grandparents, parents, and children all had to navigate the reality of sexual abuse while trying to maintain family bonds and pass on survival knowledge without traumatizing younger generations unnecessarily. The role of technological innovations in agriculture and plantation management sometimes created new opportunities for abuse or new methods of control. Changes in work processes, living arrangements, and supervision systems all had potential implications for the safety and vulnerability of enslaved men. The development of coded artistic expressions within enslaved communities provided outlets for processing trauma while maintaining the secrecy necessary for survival. Quilts, songs, dances, and other art forms often contained hidden meanings that allowed communities to discuss their experiences without exposing themselves to additional danger. The impact on concepts of justice and revenge within enslaved communities was complex and varied. While some survivors fantasized about eventual retribution against their abusers, others focused on survival and protection of their families, leading to different approaches to resistance and cope. The role of seasonal social events and gatherings within white communities often created periods of increased danger for enslaved men. Parties, weddings, and other celebrations sometimes provided cover for abuse or created situations where white women felt emboldened to act on predatory impulses. The intersection of sexual abuse with the broader system of racial control reveals how individual acts of violence supported larger structures of oppression. The abuse of enslaved men by white women was not aberrant behavior but rather an integral part of the system designed to maintain white supremacy through terror and dehumanization. The long-term psychological consequences of this abuse extended far beyond the immediate survivors to affect entire communities and future generations. The trauma of systematic sexual exploitation became embedded in the collective memory and experience of African American communities, influencing relationships, family structures, and approaches to survival for decades after emancipation. Understanding this hidden history requires confronting uncomfortable truths about the intersection of race, gender, and power in American society. The systematic abuse of enslaved black men by white women challenges simplified narratives about slavery and reveals the complex ways that oppression operated to maintain systems of racial control and exploitation. The courage required to examine and discuss this history is significant, but it is necessary for honest historical accounting and genuine progress toward justice. Only by acknowledging the full scope of slavery's horrors can we begin to understand their lasting impact and work toward healing and reconciliation. The voices of these enslaved men, silenced by centuries of shame and fear, deserve to be heard and their experiences acknowledged as part of the complete historical record. Their suffering was real, their resistance was remarkable, and their stories must not be forgotten or dismissed in our ongoing efforts to understand and address the legacy of American slavery.